I know, I see him.
Mate, their tentacles are 20 feet long.
If you do follow my channel, you'll know that recently I did a video on my first ever blue water spearfishing trip in the Azores. I'll pin a link to the video in the comments if you haven't seen it. But as a result of that video, my Instagram DMs and Facebook absolutely inundated with messages of people asking me questions about blue water spearfishing. Now, although I do not claim to be an expert, I had a bit of a crash course in the Azores, so I've decided to put this video together with my top 10 lessons from my first ever blue water spearfishing trip. I think it could be really useful to you if you're planning a blue water hunting trip. So let's get straight into it. 10 lessons, and I do have something a bit crafty to ask at the end of the video, but we'll get to that. Okay, so my first lesson is that local knowledge is priceless. One really good thing to do is to call the spearfishing store in the area you want to go hunting. And they are probably going to know some contacts that are going to be able to take you out. Guides, teachers, this kind of thing. They may even be able to lend you equipment because blue water guns and blue water float setups are very, very expensive. So on the recent trip to the Azores, I met up with, first of all, Guy Bruges and then Pedro Januero from DBM Azores. And these characters are basically human seals who know the water so well. They understand the equipment, they understand the marks, and also they were able to lend us weights, so we didn't have to fly on the plane with a ton of weight. Lesson number 2 is about flying with spear guns. If you're taking your own spear guns to your blue water spearfishing trip, first thing to bear in mind is they're going to need to be big guns, probably at least 120 centimeters long, because longer guns have more power and more range. And if you're going to take these guns with you, you need to package them really carefully. Now, we took our spear guns in spore tubes. You can grab them off Amazon. They kind of extend or get smaller according to the length of the gun, and really useful for transporting your spear guns safely. That said, if you're going with a guide and they're able to supply you spear guns, I would strongly recommend using their spear guns because flying with the guns is expensive, and also you can never be 100% sure if your gear's going to turn up. The luggage hasn't turned up, just like it didn't for Dan 5 years ago. So tomorrow we have no spearfishing gear.
And I think to cap it off, there's a haunch of venison in one of the bags that was frozen, but I suspect won't be frozen when it arrives here. And I've also got a cured pig's cheek in my bag, which...
You're not going to be expecting tip number 3 at all, but pack Vaseline, okay? The reason being is that we had absolutely tons and tons of jellyfish. There were many Portuguese man-o-war everywhere, and if these things sting you, in severe cases, they can kill you.
They're everywhere.
You're coming out, mate. Look out for this one.
I know, I see him.
Mate, their tentacles are 20 feet long.
Fortunately, with a wetsuit, you've only got a piece of your face exposed, but what we were advised to do is to cover the gap between our mask and this gap here with Vaseline. And that means if a Portuguese man-o-war did get you, its tentacles aren't actually going to be able to deploy into your skin and make you in too much pain.
There's man-o-war everywhere. There's one right there.
I don't give a shit.
Okay, what do you get?
Okay, lesson number 4, don't worry about diving deep. Okay, this is not a free diving competition. When you're in blue water setting, you're a long way offshore and the bottom might be in 40 meters, it might be in 1,000 meters. You're not gonna get to the bottom, okay? And that's unnecessary to worry about. What you need to focus on is being a hunter, not a free diver. When you're diving down, you need to be actually looking around you to see where these pelagic fish, these migratory fish might be coming from at any moment. You need to be making the most of flashes, which I'll come back to later. As these flashes are moving up and down, they're going to bring the fish up from deep water. You do not need to kill yourself trying to go all the way down. I absolutely exhausted myself on the first day, probably doing 20 or 30 dives to 25 meters where I was waiting. Now Pedro, who's got masses of experience, was shooting better fish than me from the surface. So it's about being a hunter. It's about understanding the fish, research for fish that you're catching, research their behavior, and dive smart. Don't dive like an idiot like me, and wear yourself out on the first day. Lesson number 5, triggerfish are not cool. The first fish I shot was a triggerfish. Technically that was more reef spearfishing, but still, they are a good quarry species over here in England, but going blue water spearfishing, they are not a good quarry species. In fact, I found a really interesting piece of information about the triggers out there. They are very slow moving fish. They are not that good at hunting in a blue water setting. So what really keeps them going is by trying to eat the fish that you spear. So if you did spear a fish over there, you'd see all these triggers come up and start nibbling on the fish. If you left the fish for too long, it would come back completely nibbled all over by these triggerfish. And that's as well why they were hanging around the flashes, nibbling at the flashes. Okay, you can basically just push them out the way and don't spear them. I mean, maybe that lesson is just for me, because probably no one else would go blue water spearfishing and spear them. I did, with a massive roller gun. That was quite ridiculous. All right, lesson number 6 is probably the most important lesson you could possibly learn for blue water spearfishing. Now, fortunately, I'd been given a heads up about this from the great Daniel Mann, from his channel where he went spearfishing dogtooth tuna in Tonga. Now, this lesson is the eye rule. Make sure you can see that eye of the fish before you take the shot. Then you are close enough to the fish, okay? If you can't see that eye clearly, the chances are you're too far away. So I remember with the big amberjack I caught in the Azores, I was so patient. I swam for much longer than I felt like I needed to get that fish in range. But still, when I shot it, it was a fair distance away. Okay, so lesson number 7 for me was about float line safety. Now, something that my guides did point out to me when I was out there spearfishing was sometimes I was not that aware of the position of my float line or other people's float lines. Now, you need to be aware that if you're shooting a large pelagic fish with a massive amount of power, if your float line is wrapped around your leg or your float line is too close to someone else's head and that fish pulls that float line really hard, it could end up doing some serious damage, towing you to the bottom, taking someone's head off. So you need to be really careful and constantly aware of the position of float lines, whether that's connected to a breakaway or just to the end of your gun or whatever. Having that awareness in the water of what's going on. The amount of power that fish has is exceptional, so you need to be safe. Lesson number 8 is flashes are amazing. So flashes are basically long cables which are hanging down in the water with flashy bits on. Because the visibility is so good, the fish can see these flashes from 20, 30, 40 meters away. They're going to come in and check these flashes out. If you've got the flashes, you want to stimulate them, move them up and down, and you need to be ready, because if a fish comes in towards the flashes and takes a look, it's not going to hang around for that long, because obviously it's going to quite quickly realize that it's been tricked.
Come on, go.
Can I dive?
Yeah, of course it will go away.
And the moment that fish comes in, you need to be ready to take a quick breath, possibly kick down to 3 or 4 meters and put a spear in. It's very different to spearfishing in our green temperate waters of the UK, where you're waiting in a spetto. This is totally different. And sometimes I found that as a big school of Atlantic bonito would come through, they might be coming through in 10 meters, so I'd be diving down and I'd actually be chasing to get close enough to the fish to put a shot in, which was something I really wasn't used to, but it was pretty awesome. Okay, lesson number 9 is not really a lesson, it's just a reminder to take what you need and not what you can, because obviously some of the fish in these blue water destinations are enormous. So you need to be prepared. If you're shooting, 100 kilo fish, what are you going to do with that meat? Do your research and find out how much fish you're allowed to take home with your airline. You're also going to want to have a styrofoam box ready so that you can either freeze down the fish out there and then pack it in the box with insulation. Last thing you're going to want to do is find out you've got leftover fish that you're going to waste, which would be absolute crime. Lesson number 10 is find out the exact sea temperature of the area you're going to be hunting. From your guide or your contact, find the exact sea temperature, because that will influence what wetsuit you're going to take on your trip. The last thing you want to do is take a wetsuit that's too thick, and then you're going to end up with too much weight and overheating, and you're going to have a miserable time. In the Azores, the temperature was 21 degrees roughly, so I knew that it'd be perfect in my 5mm suit, and that was really comfortable and light. But if you're getting on for high 20s, you're probably going to get away with a 3mm or 2.5mm suit. So that's a really important piece of advice, I feel, because your trip is going to be much more comfortable if you're in a thinner suit with less weight. Okay, so I hope you found this video useful if you're planning a blue water spearfishing trip. Again, take everything that I've said with caution because I'm not an expert, but I'm hoping that it can be more taken as points to think about. Jellyfish, the flying of spear guns, being able to see the fish's eye, all this stuff is important. And I was going to be cheeky and ask if anybody has any good blue water tips or destination ideas for me. I'd really appreciate if you left them in the comments, because in 2023 I would love to visit another blue water destination. Fish in the Azores were so good to eat, and I'm already missing amberjack. It was absolutely stunning to eat. So please, if you have any advice for me, I'd love to see it in the comments. Make sure you go and check out my blue water spearfishing video if you haven't. I've pinned a link in the comments section. And other than that, happy spearfishing everybody, and I will see you on the next video. Thank you very much.